Recoil. Recoil is a state management library. If you've been following my React series, you would have seen how React's own useContext and useReducer works, and how Redux works. My closing comment on Redux was that although it simplifies useContext and useReducer, and yes, it's reliable and widely used, it's still quite convoluted. If useContext and useReducer takes 10 steps to set it up before it can be used, Redux requires about 8. In comparison, Recoil requires about 2 steps. A little bit of setup is required, but none of that boilerplate code that useContext, useReducer, and Redux needs. So npm install Recoil first. Then we need to wrap the recoil root around any component that will use the recoil state. A safe place is always at the topmost layer of our React app, so we go into index.js, import recoil root from recoil, and wrap it around our app, just like that. Familiar pattern, right? That's exactly it. You can think of recoil root as the context provider. Then let's create an atom. What is an atom? It's a unit of state. Just as Redux has slice, Recoil has atom. Atoms are used with useRecoil state to get or set a single piece of state from its recoil root context. An atom represents state in Recoil, so when an atom is updated, each component that uses the atom will be re-rendered with the new value. We'll see it in action later, but let's create it first. Let's add a new folder called atoms within our source folder and create a new file called useratom.js. To set up a user atom, we import atom the function from recoil. Then export const user atom state. I will change this to user state later because why have 3 words when you can have 2? But this is essentially an atom state in recoil terms. To create the atom, we use an atom function provided by recoil. It's this function that returns a writable recoil state object. And atoms always require a globally unique key, which means you should never have 2 atoms with the same key. For our user state, let's call it user state. And just like React state, they have a default value. For this specific scenario, we can leave the default value for our user state as an empty array. You'll see default value being used for our auth modal. Speaking of which, let's create an auth modal.js as well. These are 2 different types of atoms that we're going to create to demonstrate 2 different use cases. To set up our modal state, we import atom from recoil, export const auth modal state equals atom, the function. Its unique key can be auth modal state. As the name suggests, because this is going to be a login modal that will open up if a user tries to add an event but has not logged in yet, its default value will have a boolean to indicate whether it should be open or not. So initial value for open will be false. We can have a view set to login if we think we'd want to toggle between login and sign up, for example, where the action of opening the modal is the same, but we want to see a different layout for sign up instead of login. I'm not sure if I'll use this yet, but I'm going to add it here for now, just in case I do use it later. It's a habit, unlikely to be best practice. But anyway, that is literally all the setup that we need. Now, to change atom state, we can use available recoil hooks. I've already mentioned, I think, 1, but the most common ones are useRecoil state, which is when you intend on both reading and writing to the atom. useRecoil value, which is when you intend on only reading the atom. useRecoil state, it's when you intend on only writing to the atom. And useReset recoil state, which is to reset an atom to its default value. Now, let's see the auth modal in action. Let's go into the navbar and do const set auth modal state equals useSetRecoil state and auth modal state in the parentheses. You can see that it's imported useRecoil state from Recoil and auth modal state from our modal state atom. Now, in our handle add event function, we can check to see if a user is logged in first. If they're not logged in, we tell the login modal to open. To spell it out, it would be set auth modal state, and in the parenthesis here we have an object. Open is true and view is login. If a user is already logged in, we navigate to add event. That is all. Anytime, anywhere else in your application you want to open up the modal, you just do it like this. How easy is that? I won't show how I coded the actual modal here because it's just a bunch of input fields and a lot of CSS. You can go to the relevant part of the 4-hour video to see for yourself, or there's always the GitHub link in the description. Now, just to see how we use the user state atom to set the state once a user has logged in or signed up. In our auth modal, for example, we can do const user state value, set user state value equals useRecoil state, and then user state in the parentheses. I'll change the variable in our user atom to reflect useState later. And then we can just do set user state value. Name is res.data.data.name because that's what we called the data that we're getting back from our database. If we had called that data by a different name, let's say user, for example, this would have been res.data.user.name. And the email is res.data.data.email. Now, if we go to our add event form, we can just do const user state value equals useRecoil state and then user state in the parentheses. If we console log it, there you go. We've got the values that we wanted. We can now use it wherever we want on the page. This is so much easier than the state management solutions we've seen up to this point, right? It still amazes me how quick and simple this is. And as a side note, I will acknowledge that I did not use the most accurate recoil hooks. If you're watching this, yes, please use the correct recoil hooks for your use case. I will be updating it in our next iteration of the project. But my slight errors aside, isn't Recoil just absolutely brilliant? If you want to dive into Recoil in more depth, they have a really good to-do list tutorial. I'll link it below. See you next time.